Alright, ladies and gentlemen, hopefully we got through the first section of the video smoothly. I haven't actually added it in yet, but it's just going to be a recap of the last tutorial, which was vanishing points. So hopefully that went smoothly. I'm going to jump right into the anatomy of shading. This is just a very basic shading tutorial. I think we're going to need that to move forward. We're going to be giving examples on much more complicated shapes than this in the future. But right now we're going to start with a very basic shape, a sphere. And what you see here is I've already shaded it because shading takes some time. It does take a little time. I'm going to do a little something special at the end so you can see some different shading techniques on different shapes and maybe with multiple light sources, things like that. It should be some fun, and hopefully it will be fun. I'm going to do it in fast forward, so and maybe throw a little techno beat, maybe a little rock, something to make it move along faster. But here is the basic anatomy of shading. And remember, this is a single light source shading. These things, shading can be so complicated, but it can also be so very simple. This is the type of shading you're going to use on most things. And the type of shading, I mean the anatomy of this type of shading. Alright, this arrow right here is representing our light source. This is where the light's coming in. And of course, where the light source hits, that's where the brightest is going to be. Can you guys see this? Can you guys see my cursor? In case you can't see my cursor, I'll draw a line. There we go. That's where the light is hitting the brightest. Right there. And of course, that is the lightest part of the ball. Now, usually when I'm drawing something, I don't use this much shading. I don't make it this dark. The reason I did in this case is to set an example to make it a little more extreme. Let's get rid of that line because it's going to annoy me because I did such a pretty job shading this sphere. Come on, there we go. There we go. Let's get rid of the sphere around the circle too. Alright, so that is going to be our highlight. Where the light hits the object the strongest is going to be your highlight. Hopefully you guys can read my my handwriting here. Highlight. Write that down because there are several body parts to a shadow, to a shading, and you're going to need to remember them all to make sure you get them all in. Because if you're missing one, a lot of times it will make the drawing look strange, and you'll wonder why the drawing is not looking right. And suddenly you realize, oh, I forgot, I didn't smooth out the gradient shadow enough, or I didn't shape the cast shadow properly based on the standing light source. Every drawing you do is going to have at least one light source. You have to have at least one or it's blackness. So in this case, this is a single light source, and this is where it is hitting the ball. This is the primary light source. Now, when I shade an object, I'm just going to do a little quickie ball. Let's erase this right here. We're going to do a very simple, very basic shading tutorial here, and this should get us started for the next advancement of shapes and faces. I think I'm going to do faces or hands next. I'd really like to see some comments in there, and some thumbs up and some subscriptions. Hint, 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 hint. I'm so very subtle. Yeah, if you guys suggest what you want me to see what you're having trouble with, what you want me to see you want you to see me focus on next, I'll do that. But shading's going to be integral because you're going to want to start seeing your sketches finished. Breaking things down into basic shapes is fun, but it's not as much fun if you can't finish the product. And with shading, breaking things down into basic shapes, and perspective, which were the first tutorials were perspective, were breaking things into basic shapes and perspective. So now all you need is some basic shading, and you can start producing some finished products. Now there's tons and tons of different ways to shade. There's texture shading, like say you wanted a bumpy surface, you could you could shade using little circles. You know, starting from dark to light and just using lighter circles as you go. Well, let's make a shape for this. Let's make a shape for this. Just just using darker circles as you go, as you get closer and closer to the highlight, and that'll add that texture to it. You can do the crosshatch shading, which will once again will add a different type of texture. Since this is a curved shape, we'll want to do curved crosshatches. So you'll want to start from the darkest spot, and that's going to add a completely different texture to your shade. Right now, I'm working on a smooth shade, and the way I got this smooth shade is a technique just about every artist uses. I don't use it very much. It's called smudging. It's called smearing. It's called in this application, it's called blurring. So basically, I do a scribble line, which is my typical shading style, which is just me scribbling. And you know, I start dark and get lighter. I always start at the darkest point and get lighter because I find that's the easiest way when I'm working with pencils. But basically, smearing is you take your eraser, you take your finger, and you after you've made your grade, you just smooth it out, and you see how much smoother that. And I turned all those scribble lines into. I'll just do the scribble line underneath of it of the exact same shade. It turned those scribble lines into a much smoother transition. One of the most important things about shading is the transition. You know, if you go directly from too dark to too light, it's not going to look natural. It's going to look like there's a border there. There's going to look like there's a solid line that's keeping you that's keeping you from reaching your target. So you want to have many layers of colors starting of shades starting from darkest to lightest, and so you want to transition that as smoothly as possible. You see, if you go too quick from dark to light, you won't. It looks less like shading and more like lines. So you want to take your time with your shading. Take your time with your shading. See that dark line? I need more darkness next to it to make it transition smoother. See, you go a little more, and then once you think you've gotten the grade smooth enough, then you can go in and smudge and smear if you need to. If you don't want to, if you want to use a texture, obviously a smudge. Actually, that looks kind of cool. But a smudge can often get rid of your textured shade. And a lot of times you want to use a textured shade Sometimes you want to use a thicker pencil on your shading. I'm not going to do that because every time I change the pencil function, I screw it up and I fight to get it back. But anyway, so far I've pointed out the highlight. You have the highlight. That's that's the primary focus of the light, and light travels in straight lines until it hits something. It comes in and then it bounces off. And that's going to be the same for everything. You know, you see this light, the light's going to come in, hit the highlight, and bounce away. Going to come in, hit the highlight, and bounce away. And as it goes away, it gets dimmer. So that's why the grade, that's why you have a highlight and then slowly darkening. That looks kind of like a meteorite. Okay, I'll bleep that out. You didn't hear that? Hopefully I'll bleep that out. Anyway, the highlight, the lightest part. This is where the light hits first, and this is where it's going to bounce away, and it's going to decrease in strength the further it gets away from where it first strikes the object. Okay. Next, you have the gradient shadow. You have it. This is where the light is slowly getting weaker as it flows away from where it first strikes the object, or where it's most strongly impacting the object. Light doesn't travel alone. It's not just a single photon. You're going to have a bunch of photons, but they're going to be most concentrated in one spot. These are all little photons. They're all traveling at the speed of light, but from their source, which is like, for instance, a flashlight, from their source, most of them are going to be concentrated in one spot, but you're going to have a few stragglers, and it's going to be weaker as it goes away. So the main amount of photons are hitting this, and lesser photons are hitting here, and they're bouncing away, and so that creates the gradient shadow to the deepest shadow. So we'll write gradient shadow down here so you can keep track. Stop pushing the button, Patrick. Gradient. Can you guys even read my handwriting? And I probably spelled that wrong. You know, I'm going to... It's either an E or an A. Does an A look right? No, it's definitely an E. See, now even the E doesn't look right. It's a gradient shadow. Meaning that it's got a grade to it. It's gradual. Its change is gradual until you reach the darkest shadow. And the darkest shadow you would think would be farthest from the light source. And that's not always the case. In this case, this ball is sitting on a table. And it's round. This is a sphere. So therefore, you know, it is two-dimensional because it's on a two-dimensional surface, but you're trying to make the illusion that it is not two-dimensional. So less light is going to fall behind the ridge. Less of those photons are going to fall behind the ridge of where the ball sticks out the most. So it's going to get significantly darker behind the ridge where the ball sticks out the most, the most extreme part of the ball. So it's going to get darker back there until you reach to the point where the least amount of light hits the ball. And that is not always at the edge of the ball. You'd think it would be at the edge because that's the farthest away from the light source. But like I said, photons hit things and they bounce. And this ball is sitting on a table. So some of these stray photons coming from the light source are hitting the table and bouncing back. So they're shooting in, hitting the table, and bouncing back. Now let's get rid of those because I really like how that ball turned out. Let's show it on my meteorite here. Let's fix that because I really like how the ball turned out. So I don't want to mess that up. Let's make the gradient a little better on my meteorite. We'll stick with the little circle things here. And this meteorite is also sitting on a table, being studied in a lab somewhere because it contains alien DNA. And then suddenly we found out that it matches our DNA, and we're actually from outer space. And we come from a race of three-headed trisexual beings who need 3 sexes in order to procreate. And so every sexual encounter is an orgy. And this is probably not appropriate for well, alien cultures. That's not dirty because you just it could be that they're out there on another world is a race that doesn't have just a male and a female. It has a male, a female, and a third. You never know. I'm not being dirty with this. I was just okay, it's late at night and my mind wanders. And I apologize sincerely. But anyway, the light, these photons, some of them are hitting the table and bouncing back. They're hitting the table and bouncing back anywhere they can, which is not in the cast shadow, which I'll deal with in a second. But anyway, the light that comes back off of the surface, the reflected light, is called the reflective shadow. So you've got the highlight, the gradient shadow, the deepest shadow, and the reflective shadow. And those are the main portions of the object themselves. But one of the most important shadows, which will really, really make or break a picture, is the cast shadow. But the cast shadow is the shadow is basically just where the incoming photons are blocked from hitting the surface. See, these incoming photons, the incoming light, they're blocked from hitting the surface, and so obviously that area is darker. Up to a point, because some of that light that reflects back onto the reflective shadow here, some of the lighter portion of the sphere also reflects back down onto the table. It's weak, but it's there. And if you're going into that much detail, you have to remember that there is a secondary reflective shadow in the cast shadow. You don't always have to do it. It just depends on how much detail you want to go into, how photorealistic you want to get. I personally don't like photorealistic. I like cartoony art. I like sketchy art. It gives me a happy to see just a beautiful little freehand sketch that someone draws just out of the blue. This is the anatomy of shading, and I told you it was complicated. You thought, no, you just go from dark to light. You can just go from dark to light, but you'll be missing out on some things. So the light comes in. When I do my shading, I always go, when I'm working with pencil anyway. When you're working with paints, it's completely different. when I'm working with pencil, I always go from darkest to lightest. I choose my light source. We'll just choose the same light source for simplicity. I choose my light source. I draw the object. Let's erase some of this sketchiness so it doesn't mess with the shading. And then I go from darkest to light. And the cast shadow is always going to be in the shape of whatever the object. If this were a square, let me do a quick square, just so I can do a cast shadow of a square. I'm not going to shade the square here, but your cast shadow is always going to be a two-dimensional representation of your supposedly three-dimensional object. So you always want to make sure when you do your cast shadow that it is at least representative in a two-dimensional space of the object you are shading. You see, even with this box, since this is the dark side, a lot of times with boxes, you can get away with just doing a flat color on the darkest side, even though there should be a reflective shadow right there, and on the side that's receiving a minimal amount of light, you can do a dark shade. And if you could see the top here, it would be almost bright white, but you can't because the way I drew it. Anyway, this is the basic anatomy of shading. Highlight, gradient shadow, deepest shadow, reflective shadow, and cast shadow. And if you feel like it, not always necessary, a reflective cast shadow. Like I said, that's not terribly important. It's not going to make or break the painting, the picture, if you don't notice a slight reflective shadow there. But believe it or not, reflective shadows and secondary light sources can really affect things like that. That reflective shadow, let me just show you what the sphere would look like if I did not have that reflective shadow there. Let's move this out of the way so I got some blank space over here. I'll create another sphere. This is the flat basketball that you lost the little pin thing and the pump to fill it up with in your backyard. This is that doesn't bounce anymore. It's all lopsided, but you still shoot hoops with it because you can't afford to go out and buy another one, and it's all you got. But yeah. So let's make the darkest point the farthest from the light source, which is going to be right here again, and we'll grade away from it towards the light source. And even though I did that quickly, you can see, let's make that cast shadow look a little better. Should really use a marker when I'm filling things in this quick or something. Where's my blur tool? There it is. There we go. But as you can see, that doesn't look quite right. You look at this, even though it was quick, let's use the blur tool on the one I did with the reflective shadow. you can see that there's something not quite right with it. And that's because it's missing the reflective shadow. The reflective shadow is actually quite important. It really does draw it out, and the cast shadow is quite important. Those are two things that you don't want to forget. And a lot of times reflective shadows will help you out when you don't have a light source, like you're working farther away from, you're working with a dim light source, and you need to put more detail on the other side of the face. You know, you have a face, and let's see, we'll do a quick face here. See, a head is just a square and a circle. Remember that from the first tutorial? Just a square and a circle.
Follow me. Follow me.
Sometimes it is quite nice to, let's bring the eraser in, have a little bit of reflective light or a second light source to come in and add a little bit of detail to the other side of the face. It's dramatic. It brings things out in ways you wouldn't expect. That reflective shadow is sometimes very important in keeping, especially in dramatic light sources. You see? Of course, you'll have to have shadows on this side with that brighter light source. Especially right here where there's a crest in the face. But just as an idea to explain how nice a reflective light source can be sometimes, these types of things should not be forgotten. They shouldn't be ignored. Reflective light source and secondary light sources sometimes can turn an average drawing into an extraordinary drawing. Something that's just banal into something that's exciting. Alright, so that is my anatomy of a shadow tutorial.